Okay, you know what always gets me thinking?
Hmm.
That just like deep down, human need to know what's coming next.
Oh, yeah.
The big picture, the end game, like how's it all going to shake out?
Right, right.
And when you look at all the different faith traditions out there, I think biblical eschatology really digs into that.
Yeah,
It's trying to figure out what God's ultimate plan is for like everything.
absolutely.
So today, what we're going to do is dive headfirst into one part of that.
Okay.
And it's a piece that is super central,
Right.
but it's also like hotly debated.
Yeah.
The role of Israel in how the Bible talks about the end times.
It's fascinating right from the start.
Yeah.
When you see how often Israel pops up in these prophetic visions,
Yeah.
like all the way from the Old Testament through to the New Testament,
Right.
it's like this thread that runs through everything.
It's a consistent theme for sure.
But the tricky part is
Yeah.
trying to nail down exactly what it means and how it all fits together in the bigger picture.
Yes.
That's where it gets really, really interesting.
It really does. It's almost like you're trying to untangle
Yeah.
a really, really complex knot
Right.
because you've got all these different ways that people approach the Bible in the first place, right?
Right.
Some people are reading it super literally.
Yeah.
Other people are seeing a ton of symbolism.
Mm-hmm.
And then on top of that, you have to consider the historical context.
Oh, absolutely.
Because that plays such a huge role.
Yeah, that matters so much.
And then, of course, you've got these big theological frameworks
Right.
that people are working with.
Yeah,
And those frameworks really shape how people see the whole picture.
that's true.
So what we're going to try to do today is kind of carefully
Yeah.
pick apart those different strands.
Okay.
We're going to look at some of the key Bible passages
Right.
and the major ideas that people have drawn from them.
And it's super important to keep in mind as we go along that we're dealing with prophecy here.
Right.
By its very nature, there's a limit to how precisely we can predict the future.
Yeah.
Based on these texts, what we really need is like a nuanced approach,
Right.
one that respects the different layers of meaning
Right.
and the different interpretations that are possible.
Absolutely. And you can't really talk about this
No.
without acknowledging what's happening in the world right now,
Of course, yeah.
because the modern state of Israel exists.
Right.
And for some people, that definitely influences
Yeah,
how they read these ancient prophecies.
absolutely.
But we need to be super careful
Yes.
to keep our focus on understanding the biblical texts themselves,
Right.
not getting sidetracked by what's going on in politics.
Yeah, that's really important.
So, okay, let's get into this. Where does this whole idea
Yeah.
of Israel's role in the end times
Yeah.
even begin?
Well, I think
You
the
know,
Old Testament really sets the stage.
It does feel like that.
Yeah.
Like that's where it starts.
Right. And if we're looking for a real cornerstone, like
Yeah.
a foundational piece of this whole idea,
Okay.
it's the prophecy in Daniel chapter 9,
Okay.
specifically verses 24 through 27.
Okay.
This is what's often called the prophecy of the 70 weeks.
Right.
And it's just absolutely crucial for understanding so much of the debate around Israel and the end times.
The 70 weeks, that
Yeah.
sounds pretty important.
It is.
What's the backstory here?
Oh, okay. So
What was going on when Daniel received this prophecy?
the historical setting is really key to understanding this.
Okay.
Daniel was praying during the first year of Darius,
Why?
which was around 539 BCE.
BCE.
That's about 66 or 67 years after the first group of Jewish people were taken into exile in Babylon.
Okay.
So Daniel was really concerned
Okay.
because the prophet Jeremiah had said there would be 70 years of desolation for Jerusalem.
Right.
And Daniel was really praying hard for that time to come to an end
Right.
and for God to show mercy. Right.
And restore the city.
So he's thinking,
Yeah.
okay, things are wrapping up.
Right.
And then the angel Gabriel shows up and says, actually, no.
Yeah.
It's a bit more complicated than that.
Right. Exactly.
Okay.
Gabriel appears to Daniel with a revelation
Yeah.
that went way beyond those initial 70 years.
Right.
He revealed that 70 weeks were decreed,
Okay.
not just for the desolation to end,
Okay.
but for the Jewish people and Jerusalem to accomplish 6 very specific things.
Okay, what are those 6 things?
To stop further wrongdoing, to put an end to sin, to make up for evil, to bring in a lasting state of righteousness, to confirm the prophetic visions, and to dedicate the most holy place.
That's quite a list.
It is.
Okay.
And the word weeks here.
Yeah, I was about to say, when it says weeks,
Yeah,
it's not talking about our regular 7-day weeks.
that's the common understanding, yeah.
Okay.
The original Hebrew word literally means 7s.
Okay.
But in this context, scholars generally agree
That it refers to weeks of years,
Okay.
adding up to a total of 490 years.
Right.
This longer time frame showed that God's plan for complete restoration
Right.
was going to take quite a bit longer than
Yeah.
Daniel initially thought.
So 490 years divided into parts. How does that break down?
Okay, the prophecy divides this 490-year period into 3 segments.
Okay.
First, there are 7 weeks, which is 49 years.
Oh.
And most people understand this as the time it would take to rebuild Jerusalem after the exile.
Right.
Then there are 62 weeks, or 434 years,
Oh, yeah.
leading up to the arrival of an anointed one, a prince.
Okay.
After those 62 weeks, the prophecy takes a really significant turn,
Okay. Interesting.
saying that an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing, and that the city and the sanctuary would be destroyed by the people of the prince who is to come.
Wow.
Finally, there's a mention of one last week, a 7-year period,
Okay.
where a firm agreement will be made.
Okay.
Sacrifices will stop in the middle of that week.
And someone who causes desecration will bring about terrible things.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
a lot of information packed into just
Yeah.
a few verses.
It is.
And like you said before, this is a major point where different interpretations
Right.
start to emerge, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Even just figuring out when those 70 weeks actually start is debated.
Yeah.
Some scholars point to the decree from King Cyrus
Okay.
around 538 BC, allowing the rebuilding of the temple,
Okay.
while others think it's one of the later decrees from Darius or Artaxerxes Longimanus
Yeah.
in 445 or 458 BC.
Right. Yeah, yeah.
When you start the clock, definitely changes the whole timeline.
Yes, of course.
Then there's the big question of who this anointed one is.
Right.
Christians almost universally believe
Right.
this refers to Jesus Christ, the Messiah.
Yeah.
But some Jewish interpretations have suggested other historical figures.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
And that 70th week
Right.
seems to be a real hot topic.
It really is, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, so let's look at some of the main ways people understand it.
Okay, so the preterist view,
Yep.
which generally sees a lot of these prophecies as having been fulfilled in the past,
Right.
largely believes the 70th week happened in the 1st century AD.
Okay.
They connect it to Jesus's ministry,
Okay.
his crucifixion and resurrection,
Okay.
and the eventual destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 AD.
Okay.
In this view, the anointed one cutoff is seen as Christ's crucifixion.
Okay.
The destruction is the Roman siege,
Right.
and the stopping of sacrifices is seen as being fulfilled through Christ's ultimate sacrifice.
So for them,
Yeah.
most of this is already history.
Yes,
Yeah.
the key events have already occurred.
Okay, got it. And if we compare that to the dispensational view,
Yeah.
how is that different?
They see a significant gap in time,
Okay.
the entire period we call the church age,
Right.
between the 69th week,
Okay.
that final 70th week. For them, the 70th week is a future 7-year period of intense tribulation
Right.
that will happen just before Christ returns.
Right.
They identify the prince who is to come as the Antichrist,
Yeah.
who will make and then break a covenant with a restored nation of Israel.
Okay.
The cessation of sacrifices is seen as something that will happen in a rebuilt temple in the future.
So that's a very different timeline.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it involves a different set of events
Right.
that haven't happened yet.
Correct.
And what about the covenant theology view?
So those who hold to covenant theology
Okay.
tend to see the 70 weeks as one continuous period
Okay.
that started in the Old Testament and reached its climax with Christ's first coming.
Right.
And its effects continue throughout the church age.
Okay.
They also understand the anointed one cut off as Jesus.
Okay.
They see the destruction of Jerusalem as a consequence of rejecting the Messiah.
Right.
The covenant mentioned in verse 27 as the new covenant established through Christ, and the stopping of sacrifices as being fulfilled by Jesus' sacrifice on the cross.
So from their perspective, it's more of a continuous unfolding
Yes.
and a spiritual fulfillment.
Right.
That's interesting. And the abomination of desolation that's mentioned, I imagine that gets interpreted differently too.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Preterists often link that to the Roman armies and their standards entering the temple, which was a huge desecration.
Right.
Dispensationalists see it as a future event, an actual act of desecration within a rebuilt temple by the Antichrist during the tribulation.
Okay.
And those with a covenant theology perspective often connect it to the overall desecration and chaos that led up to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD as a result of rejecting Christ.
Right.
It really highlights how one single passage can lead to such different understandings of the future.
Yeah. It does. It's truly fascinating.
It is.
And it really brings home the complexity we were talking about at the start.
Oh.
Okay, moving on from Daniel. What other Old Testament books are really important for understanding Israel's role in the end times?
Well, I think the prophecies found in Zechariah chapters 12 through 14
Okay.
are absolutely crucial.
Okay.
They really put Jerusalem right in the center of the stage during the end times,
Okay.
describing a future filled with intense global conflict that will eventually be followed by dramatic intervention from God himself.
Okay. So Jerusalem as this key focal point of conflict.
Mhm.
What exactly does Zechariah describe happening there?
He prophesies that many nations will come together in a siege against Jerusalem
Okay.
in Zechariah 12:2-3.
Right.
He describes Jerusalem becoming like a cup of reeling
Okay.
to all the surrounding peoples
Right.
and a heavy stone
Yeah.
for all the nations.
Okay.
The idea is that anyone who tries to attack or control it
Right.
will ultimately be harmed.
Okay.
This gathering of nations is often linked to the Battle of Armageddon
Right.
that we see described in the book of Revelation.
So it's really portrayed as a target
Yes.
in the end times.
Ex-
But it's not just about conflict, right?
Yeah.
There's also the promise of God stepping in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Zechariah 12:9-10 tells us that the Lord will destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem.
Okay.
Following that, he speaks of God pouring out a spirit of grace and supplication
Okay.
on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem.
Okay.
The prophecy goes on to say that they will look on him whom they have pierced
Hmm.
and mourn for him as one mourns for an only child.
Right.
This passage is widely understood as the Jewish people recognizing Jesus Christ as the Messiah they had previously rejected.
That's a really powerful image
It is.
of national repentance.
Right.
And it doesn't stop there, does it?
No, it doesn't.
There's also a vision of God's ultimate reign.
Yes.
Yeah.
In Zechariah 14:9, it declares, "And the Lord will be king over all the earth."
Wow.
This speaks of a future time when God's authority and rule will be universally recognized. After this, Zechariah 14:16 describes how the survivors from all the nations that had come against Jerusalem will go up year after year to worship the King, the Lord Almighty, and to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. It paints a picture of former enemies now in submission and worship.
That's pretty amazing.
It is.
And again, I'm sure the interpretations of all this vary. Do people
Yeah.
see that literal gathering of nations
Yeah,
or a more symbolic opposition?
precisely.
Yeah.
Premillennial views often envision a future, literal military gathering of nations against Jerusalem right before Christ's return,
Right.
followed by his direct intervention and the restoration of Israel.
Okay.
Amillennial and postmillennial views might see this gathering more symbolically
Right.
as representing the spiritual opposition to God and his people throughout the church age,
Right.
with God's ultimate triumph being realized at Christ's second coming.
Okay, so Jerusalem as this central, contested, and ultimately redeemed city. What about Ezekiel? Chapters 36 through 39 seem to deal with Israel's future as well, particularly with the idea of restoration and that prophecy about Gog and Magog.
Yes, Ezekiel 36 or 39 gives us a really significant vision.
Oh?
It starts with God promising the national restoration of Israel to their own land after their exile.
Right.
Ezekiel 36.24-28 talks about God gathering them from all the nations,
Okay.
bringing them back to their homeland,
Right.
giving them a new heart
Okay.
and a new spirit,
Right.
and establishing a renewed covenant with them.
Wow.
Then in chapter 37,
Okay.
we have that very famous vision of the Valley of Dry Bones coming back to life,
Right.
which is widely understood as a symbol of the resurrection and reunification of the nation of Israel in their land.
That image of these
Yeah.
scattered, lifeless bones
Yeah.
suddenly coming together
Right.
and being filled with life
Yeah,
is incredibly striking.
it is.
And a lot of people see a connection
Yeah.
to the modern return of Jewish people to Israel, don't they?
Many who hold premillennial interpretations do see the modern-day return of Jewish people to Israel as at least a partial fulfillment of these ancient prophecies.
Right.
But Ezekiel doesn't stop there.
Okay.
Chapters 38 and 39 introduce the prophecy of someone named Gog
Right.
from the land of Magog,
Okay.
who will lead a vast coalition of nations
Okay.
to attack this restored Israel
Okay.
in the latter years.
Okay.
Ezekiel 38 describes them coming against a land
Yeah.
that seems peaceful and unwalled
Okay.
with the intention of seizing plunder.
This sounds like a major
Yes,
end times conflict.
it does.
What's the outcome supposed to be?
Well, the prophecy is very clear that this attack by Gog and Magog will not succeed.
Okay.
God promises to intervene directly and decisively to defeat these invading forces on the mountains of Israel.
Okay.
Ezekiel 39 then describes what happens afterward, with Israel recognizing the Lord and God pouring out his spirit upon them.
And once again, the interpretation of Gog and Magog, is that usually seen as a literal future battle?
Right.
Or something more symbolic?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Dispensational premillennialists often see this as a future literal battle that will happen after Israel is restored to their land.
Right.
And they sometimes link Gog and Magog to specific modern-day nations.
Okay.
On the other hand, amillennial and postmillennial views tend to interpret Gog and Magog more symbolically, representing the forces of evil that will oppose God's people at the very end of the age,
Right.
with the battle depicting Christ's final victory over those forces.
Okay. We're starting to build this picture of restoration, conflict, and divine intervention, all centered around Israel. What about the book of Joel?
Yeah.
Chapters 2 and 3 are also highlighted as being important.
Yes.
Yeah.
Joel, chapters 2 and 3 present what's called the Day of the Lord,
Okay.
which is a key theme in eschatology that involves both judgment and ultimate restoration.
Okay.
Chapter 2 uses really vivid imagery.
Okay. Of locust plagues and a powerful invading army,
Okay.
which many see as symbols of God's intervention in history.
Right.
But within this, we find that pivotal prophecy
Yeah.
about God pouring out his Holy Spirit on all flesh,
Okay.
resulting in people prophesying,
Yeah.
having dreams and visions,
Okay.
and ultimately salvation for everyone who calls on the name of the Lord.
That's the passage that
Yes.
Peter quotes on the day of Pentecost in
Yeah.
the New Testament, isn't it?
Yes. Peter quotes from Joel chapter 2 on the day of Pentecost, as
Yeah.
recorded in Acts chapter 2,
Right.
seeing it as an initial fulfillment of that prophecy in the early church.
Right.
However, many who hold premillennial views
Right.
often anticipate a more complete and widespread future fulfillment of this outpouring of the Spirit,
Okay.
possibly within Israel in the end times.
And then Joel shifts his focus to the nations
Yeah.
and how they've treated Israel, right?
Yes. Joel chapter 3 focuses on God's judgment of the nations.
Specifically because of how they have treated Israel, with scattering them among the nations and dividing up their land.
Right.
He says he will gather all the nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat for this judgment.
Okay.
Whether the valley of Jehoshaphat is a literal geographical location
Right.
or a symbolic place of divine judgment is another point of debate.
Of course, yeah.
Importantly, Joel chapter 3 also emphasizes the Lord's role as a protector
Right.
for his people, Israel, during this time,
Okay.
describing him as a refuge and a stronghold.
So there's a theme of judgment
Yes.
for those who mistreat Israel.
Yeah.
And what's the general interpretation of this section of Joel?
Premillennial views often see this judgment of the nations as a future event
Okay.
that will take place around the time of Christ's return,
Okay.
perhaps during the Great Tribulation and at the Battle of Armageddon.
Okay.
Amillennial and postmillennial perspectives might see this as God's ongoing judgment against unrighteousness
Right.
throughout history,
Right.
which will ultimately culminate in the final judgment at the end of the age.
We've covered Daniel, Zechariah, Ezekiel, and Joel.
Yeah.
I understand that the prophet Isaiah also has a significant vision
Yeah.
for Israel's future,
Yes.
including the Messianic kingdom
Right.
and a time of global peace.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Isaiah provides a very broad and inspiring vision. He prophesies about the future regathering of the scattered people of Israel from all the nations.
Okay.
Both Isaiah chapter 11
Okay.
and chapter 66 speak to this theme.
Okay.
He also presents these beautiful and vivid visions of a future messianic kingdom
Right.
that will be centered in Jerusalem
Okay.
and will be characterized by universal peace and righteousness.
Right.
The famous passage in Isaiah 2:2-4,
Okay.
where nations will stream to Jerusalem and beat their swords into plowshares,
Right.
is a classic picture of this future peace.
It is, yeah.
Alongside these hopeful prophecies,
Yeah.
Isaiah also includes prophecies of judgment on nations that mistreat Israel and rebel against God's will.
That picture of global peace
Yeah.
in Isaiah
Right.
is so incredibly powerful. But again, I imagine the nature of this Messianic kingdom
Yeah.
is a point of different understandings.
Yes, it certainly is.
Yeah.
Premillennialists typically see this as a literal future earthly reign of Jesus Christ,
Right.
for 1,000 years,
Right.
during which the restoration of Israel will find its ultimate fulfillment.
Okay.
Amillennial and postmillennial views often interpret the Messianic kingdom more symbolically
Okay.
as Christ's current spiritual reign in the hearts of believers
Right.
and throughout the church age.
So the Old Testament really lays this intricate foundation,
Yeah, it does.
with Israel playing
Right.
a very central role
Yeah.
in these visions of what's to come.
Uh-huh.
Now, how does the New Testament build upon this?
Okay.
It seems like Matthew chapter 24,
Right.
often called the Olivet Discourse,
Yeah.
would be a key place to start,
Yeah, it would be.
with Jesus' own teachings about the end times.
It is indeed.
Yeah.
The Olivet Discourse, recorded in Matthew 24,
Okay.
and the parallel accounts in Mark and Luke
Right.
are absolutely crucial for understanding Jesus' perspective on the end times.
Okay.
Jesus is teaching his disciples on the Mount of Olives
Okay.
in response to their questions about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem
Right.
and the signs that would indicate his return and the end of the age.
And he outlines a series of signs
Yeah, he does.
that will precede the end, right?
Right.
Things like wars, famines, earthquakes.
Yes. He mentions these as events that will occur before the end,
Okay.
along with the persecution of his followers
Okay.
and the rise of false prophets who will try to deceive many.
Right.
But then he points to a very specific and significant sign.
Okay.
The abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place.
Right.
He even gives a specific instruction
Okay.
that when people in Judea see this, they should flee to the mountains,
Okay.
indicating a particular relevance to the land of Israel.
That phrase, abomination of desolation,
Yeah.
immediately brings us back to Daniel.
Right.
And once again, the way people interpret that
Yes.
is key.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Preterist views often see this as having been fulfilled in the 1st century AD,
Okay.
with the Roman armies and their idolatrous standards
Okay.
entering and desecrating the temple in the lead up to its destruction in 70 AD.
Okay.
Dispensational and more futurist views see this as a future event
Right.
that will take place in a rebuilt temple during the tribulation,
Okay.
involving an act of extreme desecration by the Antichrist.
And what happens after this abomination
Right.
in Jesus' discourse?
Jesus speaks of a period of great tribulation,
Okay.
such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be.
Wow.
Following this intense period of tribulation,
Okay.
he describes dramatic cosmic signs. The sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light,
Right.
and the stars will fall from the sky.
Right.
Then, he says, the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the heavens,
Yeah.
and all the tribes of the earth will mourn.
Okay.
And they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds with power and great glory.
Okay.
He also mentions the gathering of his elect.
And that gathering of the elect is another point where interpretations diverge. Especially when we talk about the rapture.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Dispensational premillennialists often interpret that gathering as a description of the pre-tribulation rapture of the church,
Okay.
where believers will be taken up to be with Christ before the tribulation begins.
Okay.
Other premillennial views,
Right.
as well as